be a war on terror. It's a logical impossibility. I mean, the U.S. is one of the leading terrorist states in the world. The guys who are in charge right now were all condemned for terrorism by the World Court, would have been condemned by the Security Council, except that they vetoed the resolution with Britain abstaining, of course. So, you know, these guys can't be conducting a war on terror. That's just out of the question. And we know what they did during the first phase. They did declare a war on terror 20 years ago. And we know what they did. They destroyed Central America. They killed 1.5 million people in Southern Africa. They, you know, go through the list. Okay, so there's no war on terror. There was a terrorist act, September 11th, you know, very unusual, I mean, real historic event. First time in history that the West was attacked, received the kind of attack that it carries out routinely in the rest of the world, which is a historical event. You know, naturally the West is upset. It's only, we're supposed to do it to others. They're not supposed to do it to us. September 11th did change policy, undoubtedly, not just for the U.S., across the board. I mean, every government in the world saw it as an opportunity to intensify their own repression and atrocities of whatever level they were, you know, ranging from Russia and Chechnya to, in the West, imposing more discipline on their populations and so on, every choice in between. And it had big effects. So, for example, take, say, Iraq, going to that. Prior to September 11th, there's a long-standing concern of the U.S., and I'll skip Britain, it's kind of ancillary, of the U.S. on Iraq, and that is it's got the second largest oil reserves in the world. So one way or another, they're going to do something to get it back. That's clear. September 11th gave a pretext. So there's a change in the rhetoric concerning Iraq after September 11th. We now have an excuse to go ahead and do what we're planning. And it kind of stayed like that up until September of this year. In September of this year, Iraq suddenly shifted from something we're going to take care of to an imminent threat to our existence. Okay, so early September, Condoleezza Rice came out with her warning about the next evidence about a nuclear weapon will be a mushroom cloud, presumably in New York, and a big media campaign and by political figures about got to destroy Saddam very quickly this winter, you know, because otherwise we'll all be dead. And it takes a lot of discipline. You got to kind of admire the intellectual classes not to notice that the only people in the world who are afraid of Saddam Hussein are Americans. I mean, everybody hates him, you know, and Iraqis are undoubtedly afraid of him. But outside of Iraq and the United States, nobody's afraid of him. Like not Kuwait, not Iran, you know, not Israel, nobody in Europe. I mean, they hate him, but they're not afraid of him. The United States people are very much afraid. There's no question about it. And the support that you see in polls about the war is very thin. It's based on fear. And it's an old story in the United States. I mean, when my kids were in elementary school 40 years ago, they were literally, this is not an exaggeration, they were taught to hide under desks in case of an atom bomb attack. I'm not kidding. You know? And the country is always in fear of everything. You know, it's crime, for example. I mean, crime in the United States is roughly like other industrial societies, you know, kind of a little toward the high end of the spectrum, but not off. On the other hand, fear of crime is way beyond other industrial societies. That's why you have 10 times as many people in jail as in comparable countries. It's engendered, you know, it's very consciously engendered. There's good academic studies of it by politicians, by media, and so on. And the country's in constant fear all the time. These guys now in office, remember, they're all almost entirely from the 1980s. They've been through it already, and they know exactly how to play the game. Right through the 1980s, they periodically had a campaign to terrify the population. 20 years ago, it was Libyan hitmen, you know, roaming the streets of Washington and killing our leader and stuff. Then it was, you know, Grenada, Russian air base, happened to be built by the British, but that was not noticed. You know, Russians are putting up an air base and they're going to bomb bomb us from Grenada. The Sandinistas are 2 days marching time from Harlingen, Texas. You probably remember that. National emergency called. You know, the tourism industry in Europe collapsed every couple of years because Americans were afraid to travel to Paris, or because there might be an Arab hiding behind a telephone booth or something or other. And it just went on like that, you know, and the country's in constant fear. So to arouse fear is not that hard. The timing was so obviously for the congressional campaign that even political commentators couldn't miss it. And they're going to need to do it now because they're going to, after, you know, for domestic political reasons. I mean, they've got the presidential campaign is going to be starting not that far away. You know, it starts in the middle of next year, early next year, and they got to have a victory under their belt and on to the next adventure. Otherwise, the population is going to pay attention to what's happening to them, you know, which is a big assault, you know, a major assault on the population, just as they did in the 1980s. They're replaying the record almost exactly. The first thing they did in 1981 was drive the country into a big deficit. This time they did it with a tax cut for the rich and the biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years. You know, you combine those two, you go from a budget surplus to a budget deficit. If you have a deficit, you have to have Alan Greenspan showing up with a long face and talking about fiscal responsibility, which means cutting the already low level of benefits for people, lack of job security. It happens to be an unusually corrupt administration, so it's kind of like an Enron administration. So there's a tremendous amount of profit going into the hands of an unusually corrupt group of gangsters, and you can't really have all this stuff on the front pages. So you got to push it off the front pages. You have to keep people from thinking about it. And there's only one way that anybody ever figured out, frighten them, and they're good at it. That they did it. That's their experience, and they'll keep doing. So there's domestic political factors have to do with timing. September 11th gave the pretext, and there's a long-term interest, serious interest. So they got to go to war. You know, the only question is how they'll work it out.
Could I ask on the timing of a potential war with Iraq? Quite a few people have said that the timing was going to be relatively quick. They're going to find an excuse in the short term, but increasingly reports we're seeing from the US say that actually they figure it would be better to have the war in maybe as long as 12 months' time from now, to fit better with presidential politics, so they don't win their war and then lose the effect by the time they have the election. Is that more of a... I
saw some article by Dan Pletch, I think, about this, claiming to have sources in Washington. You know, I don't think anybody knows. They probably don't know. You know, so we're speculating. But my speculation would be that they would like to have it over with before the presidential campaign. The problem is that when you're in a war, you don't know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, the chances are it'll be a pushover. It ought to be. I mean, there's no Iraqi army. You know, the country will probably collapse in 2 minutes. You know, but you can't be sure of that. And in fact, if you take the CIA warning seriously, they're pretty straight about it. I'm sure it was published here. You know, I mean, they're saying, you know, if there's a war, Iraq may respond by terrorist acts. And what could those terrorist acts be? Well, they could be pretty serious. I mean, years ago, there were technical studies circulating saying that it wouldn't take that much competence to put together a nuclear bomb and a dirty bomb in the New York hotel room. And you smuggle the parts across the Canadian border, which is totally porous. You know, I could smuggle things across the Canadian border. There's no way of barring it. And it's not a big deal. There's loose nukes around in Russia and Pakistan, you know, all over the place. Any dedicated group of people could be doing that. And the government studies estimated before 9/11, you know, a couple of years before September 11th, that the probability of success for a well-planned operation to put a nuclear bomb in, say, a New York hotel room would be about 90%, way higher than any missile attack. And in fact, MIT Press published a technical study about 4 years ago by 3 so-called, you know, strategic analyst types, which is like a guidebook to terrorists. It's called America's Achilles Heel, if you want to take a look at it. It came out around 1998. And it's just a, kind of a list of possible terrorist actions that you could carry out and how you could do it. And it's mostly pretty simple, like wouldn't take much. So it's possible that they're in place. And, like international relations guys like Kenneth Waltz, for example, have been pointing out that U.S. adventurism is just driving countries into developing weapons of mass destruction and terrorism as a deterrent. They don't have any other deterrent. Conventional forces don't work, obviously. And there's no external deterrent, so these guys are just free to do what they want. And the only way anyone can defend themselves is terror and weapons of mass destruction. So it's plausible to assume that they're doing it. I suppose that's the basis for the CIA analyses. I doubt that they have any intelligence, but and I suppose British intelligence is saying the same thing. They probably are. So yeah, that those could be consequences. But you don't want to have that happen in the middle of a presidential campaign. You want it to be done, and you want the war to be over. There is the problem about what to do with the effects of the war, but that's easy. You count on journalists and intellectuals not to talk about it. So how many people are talking about Afghanistan? Afghanistan's sort of back where it was, run by warlords and gangsters, and women are about where they were before. I mean, I just met Christina Lamb a little while ago, and it just happens by accident. A couple of days ago, I was reading articles of hers from the 80s. She was in Kabul around 1989, talked about it a little. But her description of Kabul in 1989 looks like paradise as compared with what it is now. I mean, at the university, women are running around with, mini skirts and smoking cigarettes and doing anything they feel like. And, it was by comparison, not the rest of the country, but, but the rest of the country now is the same as it was under the Taliban pretty much. But in Kabul, it hasn't gotten back to what it was in 1989. Actually, the head of the UN has had there's a very Indian woman, Rasul Basu, who was the head of women's affairs for the UN back in the 70s and the 80s. She's a well-known lawyer, Yale Law School graduate, and that sort of thing. She was writing in the late 80s in she was in Afghanistan as the UN officer for women's affairs or some such thing. And through the late 80s, she was writing articles about how if the people the Americans are organizing take over, it's going to be a complete disaster, especially for women, but for everybody else. And even the feminist magazines wouldn't publish her articles. Like Ms. in the United States wouldn't, or The Nation or anybody wouldn't publish what she was saying because it's the wrong story, and they're still not saying it. But if you take a look at Afghanistan now, who's writing about it? I mean, almost nobody. So if it goes back to what it was, who cares? Everyone's forgotten about it. And if Iraq turns into, let's say people slaughtering each other, you can, I can write the articles right now. Backward peoples. I mean, we tried to save them, but all they can do is murder each other because they're, dirty Arabs and that sort of thing. But you have to have it over. So, and by then, I presume, I'm just guessing, that they'll be on to the next one, which will probably be either Syria or Iran. In fact, the war with Iran is probably already underway. According to, again, there's not a lot of evidence, but if you look at American scholarly sources, they're claiming, I don't know, they don't give a lot of evidence, that like Robert Olson, who's the main American academic specialist on the region, had an article over the summer in which he claims, it's known that about 12% of the Israeli Air Force and armored forces are in southeastern Turkey, presumably at the American military bases. And according to him, they're there because they're preparing for the war against Iran. They don't care about Iraq. Iraq, they figure, is a pushover. But Iran has always been a problem for Israel. It's the one country in the region that they can't handle. And they've been after the U.S. to take it on for them for years. And according to this report, the Israeli Air Force is now flying at the Iranian border as part of intelligence and provocation and so on. And it's not a small Air Force. It's bigger than the British Air Force, for example, and more advanced. It's, in fact, bigger, follows bigger than any NATO power outside the U.S. And so it's probably underway. He claims that their efforts to stir up Azeri separatism in the north, which makes some sense. It's Azeri territory. It's what the Russians tried to do in 1946, was to pull it off and that would separate Iran, or what's left of Iran, from the Caspian oil-producing centers, and then you could hope to partition it or something or other. So probably that'll be underway at the time, and then there'll be a story about how Iran's going to kill us tomorrow unless we get rid of them today, and that sort of thing. At least that's been the pattern, so I don't see any reason to. So this guy might be right, but I guess that it's probably over the winter.
I would like to know, though, I mean, Afghanistan is very far away. The Middle East is a bit closer. And there is, after all, Europe, and there is considerable opposition. Well, at least,
Yeah, very considerable. It's popular, though.
More popular. And you can see it also reflected in the conflicts within governments in Europe. Yeah. Of course, there's the whole question of the accession of Turkey, which is under discussion, and I can see that people are going backwards and forwards from Wolfowitz and other people with the new government now, which they are obviously supporting and hoping very much that they will be, sort of very closely working with the regime, with the Bush regime on the war. And obviously we see the troop movements already going down to Iraq. But we do have also an opposition. I mean, whatever one thinks about the Kurds, but the Kurds are actually quite organized. And in Iraq itself, they have succeeded in the past sort of 8-9 years to build a kind of infrastructure on which, and there's a lot of support for this. Among the Kurds, after all, they are 40 million people. And there's also support for this in the other parts, like Syria,
Support
Iran, for this project.
of the northern Iraq.
Yeah, in northern Iraq.
Yeah.
And the Kurds have gained confidence on the basis of that, also partly in the north. And despite all the conflicts in between the Kurdish groups, you have somehow a movement that is growing, also in the other parts, and that I think is also decisive in relation to the problem in Iran, because there's already demands for greater equality.
But there's no indication that the U.S. is ever going to allow any Kurdish independence.
Oh no! I wasn't saying that, but I mean there is maybe a possibility, with enough efforts that could be raised within the movements that are now
the Kurdish movement. The Stop the War
movement. The
to
Stop
do
the
what?
War movement. To raise the importance of this issue.
It's a very important issue, but I don't exactly see how to raise it, because the chances are that the Kurds, I mean, I hope it's not true, but my guess would be that the Kurds in northern Iraq are going to be among the main victims of the war. After they have achieved a lot, there's no doubt, but it's as you know, it's a very dependent society. It's not self-supporting in food or fuel or anything else. And if there's, you don't know what the effects of war are going to be, but the chances are at least disruption, and who knows what will happen. I mean, the UN's HCR, is already preparing for the flight of hundreds of thousands of people, sort of expecting the worst. And maybe it'll happen, maybe not. But the idea that the U.S. will allow any meaningful autonomy in the north is extremely unlikely. I mean, they know the Turks would go berserk, and Turkey is a lot more important to the United States than Iraqi Kurds are. So, I mean, they've been willing to sort of tolerate the Iraqi Kurds because it fits into general strategy. But, like if they move on Kirkuk or something, they'll probably be slaughtered, I would guess. And the chances are, it's conceivable, I don't know if it's true, that it might start up the PKK-Turkey war seriously. I mean, it's already going on. The Turks continue anyway, but PKK's been quiet, but they may not be. And then they may go after the Turkish Kurds again.
So you don't think there's any kind of policy that
well,
we can sort of push here
not,
in terms of the support of the Kurds
I don't
on the
see it
European
within,
level?
not, well, you know, I can't think of any within the framework of support of the war. I mean, support of the war, you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you know, you can imagine a nice scenario, like maybe they'll put in a democratic government in Baghdad and it'll turn to federalism and everybody will be happy, but, you know, the chances of that seem awfully remote. I mean, one problem with it, serious problem, is that the majority of the population is Shiite. So if you had anything remotely like a democratic system, they'd be the dominant force. And the U.S. is extremely unlikely to support a Shiite majority in Iraq, you know, especially if Iran's next on the target. I mean, the Shiite Iraqis are not pro-Iranian by any means, but, you know, they will probably join the Arab world, the rest of it, in moving towards accommodation with Iran, which is the last thing the U.S. wants. I mean, part of the reaction to the last bombing of Iraq, 1998, was that the Arab allies of the United States began to move towards accommodation with Iran. So you remember it was right around then, I think, right after the bombing, that there were two big conferences. The U.S. ran one in Qatar, and the Iranians ran one in Tehran. You know, and everybody went to Tehran. They didn't go to Qatar. There's a pretty strong statement to the U.S. that they're not going to like. In fact, right at that time, Saudi Arabia invited Rafsanjani, the former president, to come to Saudi Arabia, and they'd had very hostile relations, and they treated him like a king, you know. About the same time, Madeleine Albright or somebody showed up, and they barely talked to her, you know. And since then, they have moved toward accommodation. And I would assume that I'm sure the State Department assumes that if Iraq has anything like a democratic government, so the Shiite majority has some kind of voice, they'll join in these efforts, maybe even accelerate them, which is just doesn't fit with the U.S. planning. And the same with the North. I mean, if they allow any meaningful autonomy to the Kurds in the North, it's not going to stop there. It'll spread over the Turkish border, and the Turks are not going to tolerate that. So, while it's, you know, a delightful scenario is imaginable, and, you know, hope maybe it'll come, but to count on it seems pretty far out. My guess is the Kurds are going to be among the worst victims of this war. And in fact, what they have achieved in the North may well be destroyed.
You mentioned the importance of oil in Iraq to the States. How do you see the vast military production machine that is America requiring war as an advertisement for their equipment?
Requiring oil?
No, requirement of war.
Oh, war, isn't it?
Being,
yeah. I mean, that's true. You know, like Lockheed Martin's always going to call for preparation for war and war, because if you destroy war equipment, you sell more of it. But you have to remember that what's called military industry is just high-tech industry. I mean, military industry is indistinguishable from general high-tech industry. The military is kind of a cover for the state sector of the economy. I mean, like at MIT, where I am, everybody knows this except the economists. And everybody else knows it because it pays their salaries. You know, so the money comes into places like MIT under military contracts to produce the next generation of, you know, the high-tech economy. You know, you take a look at what's called the new economy. You know, computers, internet, that sort of thing. Yeah, it all comes straight out of places like MIT under federal contracts for research and development under the cover of military production, and then it gets handed over to IBM when you can sell something. So like, you know, my wife, for example, in the 1950s was a programmer at a military lab at MIT, Lincoln Laboratories. And it was supposed to be top secret and everything, except everybody knew exactly what was going on. It's all totally open. And the people flowing up. I was in the electronics lab at MIT, and under 100% military contracts also. And it was perfectly clear. They were working on what they called an air defense system. So she was programming for an air defense system. It was a total joke, you know. I mean, everybody knew he couldn't defend anyone against a First World War bomber piloted by Snoopy or something like that. And besides, nobody cared about bombers anymore because they were going on to intercontinental missiles. But what they were actually doing was developing computers. I mean, in those days, in the 1950s, a computer would have filled, a single computer, this entire building with the vacuum tubes blowing up all the time and paper going all over the place. And, you know, it's just unwieldy. And by the end of the decade, around 1960, they had succeeded in reducing a computer to a mainframe, like, you know, half the size of this room. At that point, you could start selling them. So the head of the project pulled off and founded the first mainframe firm, DEC. Meanwhile, IBM had been ripping off the research at MIT and Harvard on government contracts, and they were kind of figuring out how to make smaller computers too, and then they went on through the early 90s developing computers under government contract for either the Pentagon or the National Security Administration and so on, and finally they got to the point where they could sell them, and then you have computers. Same with the internet. 30 years it was in the government system. Started at places like MIT, and the same with everything else. You go across the board. Now, if you take a look at MIT now, where I am, the surrounding area used to have small electronics firms. Now it has small biotech firms. The reason is because the next cutting edge of the economy is going to be biology-based. So funding from the government for biology-based research is vastly increasing. And if you want to have a small startup company that'll make a huge amount of money when somebody buys it someday, you do it in genetic engineering or biotechnology and so on, and ultimately it'll make profits for somebody. And that's military industry. So yes, military industry wants it, but so does industry, because it's the same thing. You know, they're just one component of it. In fact, there's almost no element of the economy that doesn't work like this. And that's why, in fact, and it goes right through history. You know, it's usually dynamic state sector that gets economies going. So military industry wants it, and not only for this reason, but you know, they want, one of the reasons they want to control the oil, they don't want access to the oil. That's a mistake. It's commonly discussed, but the U.S. doesn't even care about access to the oil. They expect to use Atlantic Basin sources, which are much more reliable, you know, like West Africa and Venezuela and so on. But they want to control it. And you control it because, first of all, the profits flow back. And they flow in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not just oil company profits, it's also military sales. So the biggest purchaser of arms, of U.S. arms at least, probably British. I mean, it's either Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. It's one of the rich oil producers. They draw most of the arms, and that's profits for high-tech industry in Britain and the United States. And or just money goes right back to the U.S. Treasury and Treasury securities. And in various ways, this helps prop up the primarily British and U.S. economies. In Britain, it was dramatic. I mean, in Britain, I don't know if you ever looked at the records, but probably have. But in 1958, when Iraq broke the Anglo-American condominium on oil production, they pulled out of the system, Britain went totally crazy. I mean, Selwyn Lloyd, who was then Foreign Secretary, flew to Washington, and these are out in both the British and American records, and they discussed what to do to prevent. So the British at that time maybe still were very reliant on Kuwaiti profits. The Kuwaiti Investment Corporation was in London, meaning under British control, and Britain was getting, you needed the petrodollars for supporting, you know, the British economy. And it looked as if what happened in Iraq might spread to Kuwait. So at that point, Britain and the U.S. decided to grant Kuwait nominal independence. Up till then, it was just a colony. And they said, okay, you can run your own post office and, you know, pretend you have a flag and that sort of thing. But of course, Britain will run it. And they said, you know, Lloyd said, if anything goes wrong with this, we will ruthlessly intervene to ensure maintaining control. And the U.S. agreed and said, yeah, they do the same thing in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. But that's control, that's not access. I mean, at that time, North America was the biggest producer in the world. You know, they didn't use one drop of Saudi oil.
I've also heard the suggestion that it's a way of America controlling the European and the
Japanese.
Pacific Rim.
Absolutely. I mean, you go back to around 1950, the smarter guys like George Kennan were pointing out that control over the energy resources of the Middle East gives the U.S. what he called veto power over other countries. He was thinking particularly of Japan. Europe's considered under control, but so like if Japan goes off on its own, we'll strangle them. And the Japanese know it perfectly well, so they've been working very hard to try to gain independent access to oil resources. I mean, that's one of the reasons they've tried hard and succeeded to an extent to establish relations with Indonesia and Iran and others to sort of get out of the U.S.-controlled system. I mean, they're not stupid. They know that the U.S. has veto power over them. Actually, the Marshall Plan, you know, this great benevolent plan, one of its purposes was to shift Europe and Japan from coal to oil. Europe and Japan both had indigenous coal resources, but if they switch to oil, then they're under U.S. control. So I think about $2 billion out of the $13 billion Marshall Plan dollars went straight to the oil companies to try to give them free, you know, to make them able to help convert Europe and Japan to oil-based economies. And that makes sense too. As a technique for power, it's enormous significance to control, you know, to control the resources. And you know, this is expected to be the main resource for the next couple of generations. Actually, they're interesting. If you're interested, the National Intelligence Council, which is a collection of the various intelligence agencies, published a projection in the year 2000. It's called Global Trends 2015. You can pick it up on the internet. It's under I think it's under the CIA listing on the internet. And it's, you know, nothing terribly surprising about it, but it's an interesting document. And they predict for the next 15 years that Persian Gulf oil will be increasingly important in the world energy, you know, industrial system, and that the U.S. won't rely on it. The U.S. will use, you know, Atlantic Basin resources, but it's got to control it, of course. And they expect, incidentally, they also make the interesting prediction that terror is going to increase, and it's going to increase as a result of globalization. And you know, they really have it straight. They say what they call globalization is going to lead to a widening economic divide, and a lot of just the opposite of what economic theory predicts. It's supposed to lead to convergence. But they're realists. They're not studying in MIT economics department. And it'll lead to a widening economic divide, and they say that's going to lead to increased disorder and tension and hostility and violence, a lot of it directed against the United States, in other words, terror, because you're going to have more people who are dispossessed and you know, going to be angry, and who knows what they'll do. So you have to have more military planning, because you got to control them. You know. And
yeah, I'm just wondering how instrumental you think oil is in explaining U.S. intervention, state terrorism in Colombia,
yeah.
also support for the coup in Venezuela.
You know more than I do, but
So there's a question about oil in terms
yeah.
of explaining U.S. interventionism, and also as a sort of subset to that question, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the kind of what you could call sort of counter-hegemonic bloc developing in Latin America. In Ecuador now, and Brazil,
Yeah.
Venezuela, and the kind of continued failure of the neoliberal experiment that was Argentina. A sort of threat of a bad example of neoliberalism. So I'm wondering, so you basically, so I'm interested in hearing what you think of oil as an explanation for U.S. intervention, and also what you think the possibilities are of this counter-hegemonic bloc, how that will affect U.S. policy, and what do you think the likely responses would be? I presume there will definitely be responses.
Well, oil's surely a major issue. Venezuela's been, after all, the U.S. kicked Britain out of Venezuela 80 years ago under Wilson, just at the point when and the U.S. wasn't a big global power at that time. It usually was stuck around the Caribbean, but the first big move in the Western Hemisphere was Venezuela, and they got rid of the British because they knew it was going to be an oil producer. I mean, and then the U.S. was by far the main oil producer, but they're thinking ahead. And that continues. I mean, Venezuela remains, since around 1970, it's been the primary source for external support for oil. And yeah, Colombia's got substantial resources. You know, it's not Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, but it's kind of like Central Asia. You know, it's significant. And the same is true of Brazil. They're counting on Brazilian oil and possibly Ecuador. And you know, there's no doubt that that's an issue. How big an issue you can argue, but you look at the funding. I mean, you know better than I do, so I don't have to tell you. But the funding, a lot of it goes to protecting the oil pipelines. You know, just training forces to protect the pipelines. As far as and yeah, that's a big piece of the potential oil resources, and not just oil, but everything else too. I mean, you know, gold, emeralds, you know, there's all kind of resources there. Actually, the place where I was, we corresponded about this in Cauca in the south. Part of the reason for driving the peasants out is because of doesn't have to be oil there, but there's just other resources, including coal, incidentally. If you drive the peasants out of the mountains, you can strip mine the mountains. And, you know, apparently the coal's very high quality. And like right around Boston, and my daughter happens to be she's a Latin Americanist who, kind of a political activist who works on, she's now working mostly on Columbia, but she teaches in a working class college near Boston. They've set up a sister city project. She's set up a sister city project between the town and part of Colombia, Guajira, because that's the source for the coal that's used for a highly polluting power plant in the town where she lives, and everybody hates the power plant, so that was a way to organize people in a poor working class town where they'll think about international affairs for Columbia Support Committee, which worked out pretty well. So there's this kind of thing going on. And as far as the counter-hegemonic bloc is concerned, it's got to be a big issue in the planning sections in the U.S. They're surely upset about it. And you can see what happened in Brazil. You know, they very quickly, even before the election, they made sure that Lula is not going to be able to follow the, you know, the decision of the Democratic vote. I mean, they were right away, before the election, there was a big attack on the real, you know, went way down. The interest rates had to shoot astronomically high, growth stops, capital flows out of the country. I mean, that's the main point of neoliberalism. Now, the main point of it doesn't do anything for the economy, probably harms it, even harms profits, but it does undermine democracy. It's a terrific tool for undermining democracy. That was understood by Keynes and White back in 1945. That's why the Bretton Woods system was based on capital control, because they understood that there's no other way to allow governments to pursue social democratic policies. Support for them was enormous at the time. So yeah, and that led to a huge period of great economic growth, the best in history, and also welfare state programs around much of the world, you know, with egalitarian growth. In the early 70s, when they dismantled that system, it was completely understood that this is simply going to reverse the process. It'll undermine the threat of democratic governments. And you can see it playing out in Brazil just dramatically. I mean, the big democratic majority, you know, committed president, decent guy. He's right back following the Cardozo programs, and you can't blame him. There's nothing much else he could do except declare a revolution or something. And at the same's happening in Venezuela as they're moving right onto a military coup. 40 years from now, we may get some documents saying that, you know, the U.S. is sponsoring a military coup, but you can just see it playing out in the streets day after day. Ecuador has a major U.S. military base now. It's been put in sort of quietly, but it's there. Peru is going to be the same. Argentina, I don't know what they're going to do with Argentina. It's kind of, you know, there's a lot of popular organizing going on there, on takeover of plants, building up a kind of a popular economy. I don't know where it'll go, but it's got to be a concern that from Argentina up to Venezuela, there's extreme unrest. And, I mean, it's kind of interesting to compare it with, say, 40 years ago. So when Brazil did have a populist president back in the early 60s, Goulart. And at that time, the technique for stopping it was just a military coup. So Kennedy and Johnson administrations carried out a military coup. That was the first big national security state in Latin America. This time they don't have to do that. First of all, they probably can't because the military probably couldn't do it, but they also don't have to because Clinton provided them with the techniques of control, namely neoliberal financial liberalization and privatization. And that's enough, I mean, unless there's a real revolution. So the effects of these programs, you know, people have talked about a lot about the popular movements have talked, like here, you know, have talked about the economic effects, which are real. You know, it does harm people, it destroys the environment and so on, but the main effect is just to undermine democracy. It eliminates the possibility of democratic choices. How far it'll go, you know, who knows?
So I'm aware that we're quite into time. I wonder if we could just get a couple of questions, which I know that people have talked about, which is about the issue of how the current situation in relation to Iraq compares, the anti-war movement and the protest movement building up, how that compares now to Vietnam. What do you think we can achieve as people involved in direct action and protest? What do you think its value, and do you think there is a possibility that we can prevent a war from occurring?
Preventing a war is really hard because the timing is very short, and you make it costly, which is important. I mean, even if it doesn't stop, it's important for the war to be costly, because to try maybe stop the next one, you know. As compared with the Vietnam War movement, it's just incomparably ahead now. I mean, people talk about the Vietnam War movement, but they forget or don't know what it actually was like. I mean, the war in Vietnam started in 1962, publicly, you know. That was the public attack on South Vietnam, Air Force, you know, chemical warfare, or concentration camps, whole business. No protest. You know, protest didn't build up for years, 4 or 5 years. And the protest that did build up 4 or 5 years later was mostly about the bombing of the North, which was it was, you know, terrible, but a sideshow. The main attack was against South Vietnam, and there was never any serious protest against that. This time, there's protest before the war even got started. I don't think, I've been asking people to think of something, but I can't think of an example in the entire history of Europe, including the United States, when there was ever protest before the war of any substantial level. You know, people have pointed out there was a little protest before Suez, but, you know, nothing. It was a small war. Now here you got massive protest before a war even started out, and it's a tremendous, you know, kind of it's a tribute to the changes in popular culture that have taken place in the Western countries in the last 30 or 40 years. It's just novel. Actually, the same was true in the 80s. The solidarity movements in the 1980s were totally new in the entire history of European imperialism. These were coming from Middle America, you know, church groups in the Midwest and stuff like that. And there were tens of thousands of people who went to live with the victims, to help them and to try to protect them. And a lot of them are still there, you know, Witnesses for Peace and a group like that. And now they're all over the world, you know, they're in the occupied territories and so on. That's never happened before. I mean, the whole history of European imperialism, or the Vietnam War, say, or anything, nobody ever dreamed of going to live with the victims. You know, it's not the kind of thing you did. You protested in the streets of the North or something if you did anything. I mean, that's completely new, you know, and very important. Didn't get any coverage, but that's because it wasn't in elite sectors. Like, it wasn't students in rich universities. It was people from rural churches and stuff like that. Actually, a lot of them evangelical Christians. You know, so it's not a right-left issue. I mean, Witnesses for Peace, which is probably the most important, comes from evangelical Christian circles. same guys who produce Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell. And so it's a kind of a, you know, the United States is a funny country. It has no politics, just, you know, no right or left or anything like that. But this was just the effects of the change in popular consciousness.
We found in Britain that probably the majority of people are against the war, according to opinion polls, and they do the same thing here, saying Saddam Hussein's going to attack you in Leicestershire or something.
Yeah.
But I was wondering what you thought about that. In a way, they need the doves. You know, they say we respect your idea, your view that you're against the war, and that's respected and so on. But as soon as you sort of break out of quite narrow, like a march every 6 months maybe, if you break out of that and actually do anything, you get attacked. I live in Brighton, a seaside town, where teenagers were pepper sprayed and battened for just sitting down in a street, and that's considered beyond the pale. Now, do you think that there's a bit of a tightening there? What do you think of those sort of actions?
Well, the more protest there is, the more tightening there's going to be. You know, that's routine. I mean, when the Vietnam War protest really began to build up, so did the repression. You know, COINTELPRO, which isn't much studied, was far more serious than Watergate, incomparably worse. And it was, you know, that was going on before, but it built up by that time. You know, I was very close to a long jail sentence myself, just stopped by the Tet Offensive. They called off the trials. After the Tet Offensive, the establishment turned against the war, and they called off the trials that were going. But, and you know, right now, I mean, a lot of people could end up in Guantanamo, I mean, if there's real protest. And people are aware of it.
Okay.
But you know, these are all, the question in all of these things is how much popular resistance is there going to be? If there's a lot of, pardon?
What do you mean by
anything from, you know, writing a letter to your representative to, you know, or organizing resistance among soldiers, whatever it is.
Just coming back on the legislation of these measures, how they are going to deal with dissent. We have, for example, here, as you know, in Britain, 2 terrorism acts. It's completely unprecedented.
Yeah.
You know, and in America, of course, the Patriot Act and many other. But what is happening worldwide is that they are actually exporting this legislation. That it's almost happening in every country. We hear from Malaysia down to Southeast Asia to Africa, etc. Now, this is an entirely new situation because this wasn't there before. And it seems that the militarization and all what you were talking about, the war, you know, it obviously forces them to intensify, to implement these measures to deal, first of all, of course, with the oppressed people, you know, who are in the particular countries challenging these policies of the U.S. government, but also eventually also in
their
other
own
countries,
populations. Yeah.
all the populations that dissent. Meaning here in Britain, you know, it won't be just the Kurds or the Tamils, it will be Mark Thomas or maybe
they'll try.
or whatever.
They'll try, but the question is whether they'll succeed. I mean, that's almost reflexive. You know, if there's protest in a country, there's going to be repression. Okay, it's like reflexive. Can they get away with it? Well, it depends a lot on the reaction. I mean, take, say, the United States. In the early 50s, I mean, there was what was called repression, McCarthyism. But the only reason it succeeded is because there was no resistance to it. When they tried the same thing in the 60s, it instantly collapsed because people simply, you know, laughed at it. And they couldn't do it. You know, these countries, I mean, even a dictatorship can't do anything it wants. You know, it's got to have some degree of popular complacence. And in a more democratic country, it's a very fragile power system. If there's sufficient resistance and opposition, they can't do it.
We have to have it from all levels, though.
Have to have it from all levels.
From the
but there's nothing, you know,
to
nothing secret about this. This is history. I better go.
Okay, we have to finish now. Professor Chomsky's got to do St. Paul's Cathedral this week.
Right, yeah.
But thank you very much.
Got to practice putting on a tie. It'll take a while.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good to see you. Yeah, keep in touch.
Yeah.